I remember the day starting just like any other. A routine Tuesday, filled with the grind and weight of deadlines that seemed to smother any enthusiasm I could muster. My wife, Anna, and I worked together at the same company, a place where we'd first met and built a life both inside and outside those sterile office walls. But today, that life felt threadbare, worn down by the same pressures, the same frustrations. Our boss, Mr. Daniels, was relentless, his temper flaring with the slightest hint of imperfection, barking orders with a contempt that settled into the air. He was a man who thrived on control, and as far as he was concerned, we were all failing to keep up. I glanced over at Anna from across the office. Despite the tirade and the mountain of work piled in front of her, she maintained an intense focus. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, eyes set forward with an energy that somehow kept her apart from the rest of us. She was immune to Mr. Daniels' harsh critiques, his stinging rebukes, almost like she belonged in a different sphere than the rest of us. I noticed that Daniels never raised his voice at her. But then again, she was the one person who consistently put in more hours than anyone else. While I was out of the door at 6, she was the one who stayed behind, sometimes until the late hours of the night, working in that echoing office when most of us were home. She told me it was because she wanted to give her all, to show her dedication to a job she loved. I suppose I admired that about her, the willingness to put in more, to do better. But today, as I left at my usual time, I couldn't shake an odd sense of unease. As much as I looked forward to my evenings at home, quiet dinners, unwinding on the couch, I found myself pausing by her desk, waiting for some confirmation, a look or gesture that she'd be home at a reasonable hour. Yet Anna was fully engrossed in her work, barely looking up as I headed out. She gave me a brief smile, one of those that held just enough warmth but somehow felt distant. Back home, I tried to distract myself, scrolling mindlessly through channels, though nothing caught my attention. Our house was filled with the comfortable silence I'd come to know well, a solitude I had long thought I enjoyed. But tonight, that silence felt heavy, thick, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets. By 8, I'd set about cleaning up, planning a quiet surprise for her. A bottle of wine, some candles to give her a break from the long workday I knew she was pushing through. Then a small memory crept up, something nagging and oddly persistent. I had left my phone in my office drawer, and my tablet too, both left behind in my rush to escape the weight of Daniel's scrutiny. A small annoyance, maybe, but I had been meaning to send some files out tonight. With a sigh, I slipped on my jacket, abandoning my evening plans and resigning myself to a quick trip back to the office. On my way there, I stopped by a flower shop and picked up a bouquet, simple, delicate blooms that I thought would bring a smile to her face. I left the flowers in the car, feeling a small spark of satisfaction at the thought of surprising her. I'd arrive quietly, slip into the office, grab my things, and give her a lighthearted reminder that it was time to come home. She was always saying she worked better alone. Maybe she'd appreciate a small break, a glimpse of normalcy, to pull her back from whatever last task she'd taken on. As I pulled up to the dimly lit office building, something felt off. It was a vague sense, the kind that creeps in just around the edges, a faint tremor of uncertainty. Still, I dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue. The building was quiet, almost abandoned. I walked up the steps, half expecting to hear the usual hum of office sounds, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, but there was only silence. When I entered, I noticed the boss's office was the only one still illuminated. And there were voices, a soft, murmuring sound that floated from beyond the door. I was caught off guard. Anna was usually alone by now, everyone else gone. But there was Mr. Daniels' voice, unmistakably low and drawn out. I felt a knot of discomfort settle in my chest as I approached, the sound of Anna's laughter filtering through. I had heard that laugh 1,000 times, had always cherished it. Yet here in this setting, it sounded different. I took a step back, the bouquet suddenly feeling absurd in my hand. I froze there in the shadowed hallway, staring at the boss's door, unable to process what I was hearing. That laugh, Anna's laugh, rang out clear and bright, a laugh I knew intimately, threaded with notes of warmth and charm. But there was something wrong in the sound now. It was too soft, almost playful in a way I hadn't heard in years, especially not with me. I took a deep breath, feeling my hands tighten around the bouquet. It didn't make sense. Daniels was still in his office this late, and Anna, dedicated, hardworking Anna, was in there with him. That faint murmur of conversation felt like a low, steady taunt, laced with undertones I didn't want to acknowledge. My pulse thudded in my ears as I took another hesitant step toward the door, trying to silence the thoughts beginning to churn. This was nothing. It had to be just a late-night meeting, maybe a review of deadlines or tasks. I pressed forward, still gripping the bouquet with a kind of nervous tension, steeling myself to turn the handle. And as I inched the door open, the scene inside hit me with all the force of a blow I never saw coming. The lights were low, a warm, golden glow from the desk lamp casting strange shadows across the room. A half-empty wine glass sat beside them, condensation trickling down the side. The space had an intimate air, like some scene pulled from a magazine spread rather than an office. And there, in the dim light, was Anna, her hair down, a look on her face that I could only describe as softness. Her gaze was fixed on him, her body angled toward his, the two of them so close that the air between them seemed charged, almost humming with an unspoken understanding. I barely recognized her in that moment. It was like I was looking at someone else entirely, someone who had no resemblance to the woman I thought I knew. And Daniels with his smug, confident posture, his relaxed demeanor, that slight curve to his lips as he looked at her, was every bit as familiar, yet as unfamiliar as she was in this context. My mind couldn't seem to catch up, couldn't reconcile this image with the life I thought we shared. A sickening, dizzying sensation crawled up my throat, a dark wave of anger, crashing over any semblance of composure I had. Before I could think, I burst through the door, the force of it rattling the frame. It was as if some invisible dam inside me had cracked, releasing every suppressed thought, every suspicion I'd tried to ignore. "What is this?" I heard myself say, my voice loud, echoing through the quiet office. "This is what you've been working so hard on? This is how you stay late, putting in those extra hours?" They jumped, both turning in my direction, their expressions a mixture of surprise and guilt, frozen for a heartbeat. Daniels looked almost irritated, as if I had interrupted something, as if I were the one intruding. And Anna, her face paled as her gaze darted to the bouquet in my hand, then back up to me, her eyes wide, as if she'd been caught in some act she never thought would see the light. I could feel the blood pounding in my veins, my chest tightening with a fury I hadn't thought possible. There was no question, no guessing, no room for explanation. It was written in the way she leaned toward him, in the wine glass between them, in the shared laughter that still seemed to echo in my ears. "Don't," I choked out, the word trembling from my lips. I felt myself take a step closer, the edges of my vision blurring. "Just don't say anything, Anna. Not a word. You think this is what I deserve? Is this how you repay me?" I could see her swallow, her gaze flicking down as if she was scrambling for some excuse. But there was nothing she could say, no answer that would make any sense of this. It felt like the world was unraveling in front of me, years of trust and memories crumbling in seconds. I dropped the flowers, barely aware as they hit the ground beside me, petals scattering like the remnants of something beautiful, something broken. Daniel started to speak, his voice low, trying to calm the situation, but his words barely registered. My gaze was locked on Anna, every detail searing into my mind as I struggled to grasp the reality of it, the depth of her betrayal. Without another word, I turned and stormed out, the sound of their voices following me, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to hear any feeble explanations, any attempts to downplay what I had just witnessed. I wanted to be out of there, far away from the sight of them together, from the image that would haunt me now, inescapable. I stumbled out into the night air, my mind spinning, caught between disbelief and rage. It was as if I were watching my life from a distance, detached from everything familiar. My own house felt foreign when I finally made it back, the silence ringing in my ears as I collapsed onto the couch. My body felt numb, my mind reeling with a question I couldn't bear to answer. How long had this been going on? How many nights had I waited for her, trusting her, only for this to be the truth lurking behind those late hours? My thoughts spiraled, and as I sat there, I felt something inside me harden. The silence in our house felt unnatural, too heavy. It was as if the walls knew, as if the very air itself held some unspoken condemnation. I stumbled into the kitchen, my hands shaking, mind racing with fragmented memories of the last few hours, but none of it seemed real, not yet. Not until I caught my reflection in the glass of the cabinet door, that look of disbelief and rage carved deep into my face, too vivid to ignore. I reached for the bottle of whiskey I kept tucked behind the spice rack. It was supposed to be for celebrations, for rare moments worth toasting. But tonight, I poured it out into a glass, a large amount, watching the amber liquid as it sloshed up to the brim. It caught the faint light from the room, and for a brief second, I thought of how I had once planned to share this bottle with Anna, to open it with her, as a toast to our life, our partnership. Now it was nothing more than a sad illusion, a bitter drink to numb what I couldn't bring myself to face. One glass turned into another, the warmth spreading through me, dulling the sharp edges of my thoughts, blurring the bitterness gnawing at my insides. I didn't want to think. I didn't want to see her face, didn't want to remember that look of guilt and surprise, or Daniel's smug expression, as if I were the fool for trusting her all along. Time lost meaning as I sat there, the minutes slipping away as I drank, each mouthful searing down my throat but giving no real comfort. I thought back to our early days, when Anna had been this radiant figure in my life, so full of ambition and energy. I had thought we were building something strong, something lasting, but all those memories felt distant now, echoes of a life that seemed irrelevant, lost to me forever. Then, the sound of a car pulling up outside broke through the haze. My heart lurched in my chest. I knew it was her, coming home to me, back to the husband she thought she could deceive. The door creaked open, and her footsteps sounded like thunder on the hardwood floor. She paused in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the dim light filtering in from the street. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" she asked, her voice soft, cautious, like she was testing the waters, feeling out the space between us. But I said nothing, didn't turn to look at her. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty glass in my hand, willing myself not to react, not to betray the torrent of emotions roiling beneath my skin. "Look, I know what you saw," she began, her tone breaking, a slight tremor in her words. "But it wasn't what you think. I know how it looks, and I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, each syllable punctuated by her shallow, shaky breaths. I could hear her moving closer, could feel her presence in the room, her desperation palpable as she searched for the right words. But there were no right words, no explanation that could fix what she'd done. I felt a dull surge of anger swell inside me, and I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. "It was a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear it was just once. I never planned for this to happen. It was the first time. It just had happened, and I hate myself for it." The confession left me cold, each word scraping like sandpaper against the raw wound in my chest. She thought saying it was a mistake would somehow lessen the betrayal. She thought claiming it was the first time would make it any easier to bear. But all I heard was her shame, her guilt, her desperate attempt to salvage something that had already been shattered beyond repair. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't bear the sight of her standing there, trying to convince me of her regret, of her remorse. It felt hollow, rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech all the way home. But she couldn't grasp the damage she'd done, the depth of the betrayal I felt. "Get out," I heard myself say, the words cold and final. I could feel her flinch, could hear the breath hitch in her throat. She tried again, a trembling hand reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled away, standing up from the table and turning to face her, finally meeting her gaze with a stare as unyielding as steel. "Please," she pleaded, her voice a strained whisper. "I know I've made a terrible mistake, but I love you. You have to believe me. I got caught up. It was nothing. It didn't mean anything. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that cut through her apology like a blade. Nothing? After everything we'd shared, every promise we'd made to each other, this was what she'd reduced it to? It didn't mean anything? I repeated, barely recognizing the icy tone in my own voice. Her face crumpled, as if she hadn't expected me to react this way, as if she thought I would forgive her, take her back like a fool. She stumbled over her words, offering feeble justifications, desperate promises to make it right. But I felt nothing, only the growing certainty that whatever we had once shared was dead, reduced to ashes by her betrayal. No, Anna, you're done here. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it, I said, my voice steady, resolute. The whiskey had taken the edge off my anger, leaving only the cold, hard resolve that had formed in its place. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she hadn't thought I'd be strong enough to send her away. But I wasn't the man she thought she could manipulate anymore. I was done being deceived, done being lied to. Take your things and leave, I added, not giving her a chance to respond. She opened her mouth, as if to argue, but I held up a hand to silence her. I'd heard enough lies, enough empty words. I didn't need more. Slowly, painfully, she turned away, her head bowed as she made her way toward the door. She fumbled with the keys in her hand, hesitating at the threshold, as if waiting for me to call her back. But I stood silent, watching as she slipped out into the night, the door closing behind her with a finality that left a ringing in my ears. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. I sank back into the chair, feeling the weight of everything settle around me, pressing down like a vice. The glass was still in my hand, empty and hollow, much like everything I thought we'd built together. I stared at it for a long time, wondering how I'd missed the signs, how I'd failed to see the truth right in front of me. And as I sat there in the dark, alone, I realized that whatever remained of our marriage had crumbled beyond repair. She was gone, and all that was left was the emptiness of what once had been. The days blurred into each other, a hollow, relentless march that I couldn't bring myself to care about. Hours would pass unnoticed, broken only by the sound of the whiskey bottle clinking against the glass as I poured yet another drink to numb myself from reality. Each sip seemed to bring me further into a fog, one where memories and anger and a twisted sense of loss mingled together in an unbreakable loop. I'd close my eyes, and all I'd see was that night, the glow of that desk lamp, the wine, the way she looked at him with that softness in her eyes. That look haunted me, taunting me each time I tried to convince myself that I'd been dreaming, that it hadn't been real. I couldn't escape it. The sight of Anna's face, the horror of that betrayal, had etched itself into my mind. Even as I sat there in my empty house, surrounded by the wreckage of what we'd once shared, it felt as if she were still there, her presence lingering in every room, mocking me. A dozen times I thought I could almost hear her laugh, a phantom sound that slipped away each time I turned to look. The silence she left in her wake was a different kind of torture, one that tore at my insides in ways I hadn't thought possible. By the fourth or fifth day, something had shifted inside me, a dark resolve that simmered beneath the grief and betrayal, coiling tighter with every passing hour. If I couldn't erase the memory, if I couldn't find peace in her absence, then I'd find something else to fill the void. And that something was revenge. My anger had a new target. It wasn't just her betrayal anymore. It was his smug face, that air of superiority he wore like a second skin. Daniels, our boss, my boss, the man who had looked down at me countless times with that dismissive gaze, the man who had taken what was mine and destroyed it. I had trusted Anna, and perhaps that had been my mistake, but Daniels had manipulated her, used his position to lure her in. And while she was gone from my life, he was still there, still presiding over the office, carrying on as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. He was powerful, yes, but I knew things about him that he thought were hidden, things that could ruin him if they ever saw the light of day. I spent hours gathering everything I knew, every whisper I'd overheard in the office, every deal that had seemed a bit too convenient, every questionable business tactic he'd ever mentioned offhand. I knew about the money he'd funneled, the offshore accounts he thought were so cleverly concealed. There were deals that skirted dangerously close to illegality, partnerships with shadowy figures he'd been careful to keep hidden from the company's official records. These were things I'd once shrugged off as rumors, office gossip I hadn't wanted to believe. But now, every piece of dirt I'd ever heard about him felt like ammunition, waiting to be fired. And so I crafted a post. Long, detailed, full of specifics that could only have come from someone on the inside. I was meticulous, laying out every allegation like a prosecutor building a case. I painted a picture of Daniels not just as a cold, manipulative boss, but as a man with no regard for anyone but himself. A man who cared nothing for his employees, nothing for the rules, and certainly nothing for the lives he ruined along the way. I exposed his illegal dealings, his backroom schemes, the secret accounts, and dirty money trails that led straight to him. I made sure it was all backed by enough truth, enough undeniable detail, that anyone who read it wouldn't question a word. As I wrote, a strange sense of calm settled over me. This wasn't just some angry rant. It was my declaration of war. I wanted him to feel exposed, vulnerable, to know that his carefully crafted facade had been shattered by someone he'd overlooked, someone he thought too weak to fight back. I wanted him to know the pain of having something he'd built crumble right in front of him. I hovered over the post button, feeling a surge of anticipation course through me. In one click, I could set the wheels in motion, could send this damning information spiraling out into the world where everyone would see it. It was a small act, maybe, but it felt like taking back a piece of my power, reclaiming a part of myself he had tried to destroy. With a slow breath, I pressed post. The words left my screen, vanishing into the ether of the internet, spreading like wildfire as they reached my colleagues, mutual connections, and anyone who'd ever worked with Daniels. I knew people would see it, friends, strangers, business contacts who'd known him for years, people who'd bought into his act, who had never seen the side of him that I'd now laid bare. Almost immediately, the notifications began to trickle in. People were reading it, sharing it, sending me messages of shock, support, disbelief. They knew, just as I'd known, that this wasn't some baseless accusation. Every detail in that post was real, every fact meticulously gathered. And for the first time in days, I felt a sense of vindication, a sense of justice. But the silence that followed was even sweeter. I imagined Daniels sitting in his office, seeing the post, reading every line as his own life, his own secrets, were laid bare for the world to see. I wanted to believe he felt the same twisting sense of loss, the same helpless rage that had consumed me for days. He would finally know what it was like to have the walls close in, to feel the panic of knowing there was no escape. The messages from friends and colleagues poured in, each one a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Many of them had suspected Daniels of unethical dealings, had felt the weight of his ruthless management style. Some had even seen glimpses of his arrogance, the way he manipulated situations to his advantage. But seeing it all in black and white, spelled out in brutal detail, had shocked them. I forwarded every one of Daniels' threats to the authorities, each message a new piece of evidence in the growing file. It didn't take long for the authorities to take interest. A few phone calls and anonymous tips later, they were looking into his records, his accounts. Daniels, the man who thought himself untouchable, was finally under scrutiny, finally facing the consequences of his own actions. And as I sat there, reading the messages, watching the fallout, I felt a strange sense of closure. It didn't heal the betrayal or make the pain vanish, but it gave me something to hold on to, a shred of control over a situation that had once felt impossible to escape. I knew that whatever happened next, I had left my mark, taken a stand against the man who'd tried to break me. Daniel's empire was crumbling, and this time, I was the one standing tall, watching as he tried, and failed. The satisfaction of exposing Daniels was short-lived. For the first few days, there was an undeniable sense of triumph, a clarity that steadied me in a way I hadn't felt since that night in his office. The endless calls and messages had poured in, a flood of people offering sympathy, validation, shock. Some even confessed they'd long suspected something was off about him. and they were glad someone had finally exposed the truth. It was like a wave, a force that took on a life of its own, with colleagues sharing the post, adding their own accounts of his ruthless management and questionable ethics. But then the threats started. At first, they came subtly. Anonymous messages from unknown numbers, emails that made their way through my spam filters, each one holding the unmistakable venom of Daniel's wrath. I knew his style too well, knew that cutting tone, that carefully measured language he used to mask his contempt. He'd written things like, "You'll pay for this, and you have no idea what you've started," each threat laced with promises that retribution was coming, that he'd make me regret ever crossing him. As the days wore on, the threats escalated. It was no longer just words, but a silent, suffocating fear that I couldn't shake. Daniels was a powerful man, connected with resources and influence that reached far beyond our office walls. I'd seen him ruin people before, watched him dismantle the careers of anyone who dared to stand in his way. And now, I was his latest target, a man he deemed expendable, a pawn who had dared to disrupt his empire. One evening, the threats turned explicit. I received a message with photos of my own home, my car parked in the driveway. Whoever had taken them had been close enough to catch the reflection of the streetlight glinting off the car's hood, the outline of my front door standing stark against the night. The realization hit me like ice. This wasn't just some angry response. This was Daniel sending a message, a promise of the lengths he was willing to go to silence me. Enough was enough. I gathered the evidence, saving every email, screenshotting every text, compiling everything into a file that I hoped would convince someone of the danger Daniels posed. And the next morning, I walked into the police station, feeling an odd mixture of dread and relief as I handed over the evidence to an officer at the desk. The officer listened carefully, her face tightening as I explained the situation, describing Daniels and the threats he'd made. When she took the file and assured me they'd look into it, I felt a glimmer of hope, a spark that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to stop him. Days passed, and I barely left the house, jumping at every sound, my mind a constant cycle of worst-case scenarios. I'd glance at my phone, half expecting to see another message, another reminder that Daniels was still out there, plotting, waiting for his moment. But instead, it was quiet, too quiet. Then one evening, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find two officers standing on the doorstep, their expressions unreadable, a strange tension hanging in the air. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, stepped forward, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Mr. Green?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my stomach tightening with a sense of unease. "We need to ask you some questions," he said, his voice professional but cold. "We've reviewed the claims you made, as well as the evidence you provided. Unfortunately, we also need to speak with you regarding some allegations that have surfaced since your report." I felt my chest tighten, a sinking feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. "Allegations?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'd come to them for help, had handed them everything in good faith, desperate for someone to take Daniel's threats seriously. But now they were standing on my doorstep, looking at me as though I were the one in the wrong. "Yes," the officer replied, his tone careful, measured. "Mr. Daniels has filed a report against you. According to his statements and the documentation he's provided, it appears that you may have engaged in certain activities that could be classified as defamation, as well as issuing threats of your own. In fact, there are charges being filed against you for harassment, and we need to take you in for questioning." The world seemed to tilt around me. I stared at the officers, their words ringing in my ears like a cruel twist of fate. Daniels had struck back, twisting the narrative, using his power and connections to turn the law against me. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that this was just another one of his manipulations. But the officers' expressions remained impassive, unmoved by my shock. Before I could say another word, they moved forward, guiding me out of my own home, their hands firm as they led me to the waiting car. I could feel the weight of their suspicion, could sense the judgment in their silence. To them, I was just another case, another man who had crossed a line. They didn't see the betrayal, the heartbreak, the twisted games that had brought me to this point. All they saw was the story Daniels had crafted, his lies woven so seamlessly into my truth that it was impossible to tell one from the other. At the station, they processed me with a cold efficiency, the familiar surroundings from my earlier visit now taking on a surreal, nightmarish quality. They questioned me for hours, their voices a relentless tide of accusations and insinuations, each one chipping away at my resolve. Every protest, every attempt to explain the truth, was met with skepticism, with a dismissive shake of the head or a probing question that seemed designed to trap me. I could almost see Daniels in my mind, watching this unfold, that smirk of his widening as he savored the knowledge that he'd won. He'd taken everything from me, my wife, my sense of security, my very freedom. And now, he was watching as I struggled in vain, caught in the web he'd spun so carefully. Eventually, they led me to a cell, the cold metal bars slamming shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my mind. I sat there in the dim, oppressive silence, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, disbelief, and a deep, hollow sense of betrayal. This cell, this confinement, was his final punishment, his last, twisted joke. For days, I sat in that cell, waiting for some sliver of hope, some sign that the truth would emerge. But there was nothing. No messages, no visitors, just the unrelenting monotony of hours stretching into days, each one eroding my spirit, my hope. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, my dignity. And now, thanks to Daniel's manipulation, even my freedom was slipping through my fingers. And yet, as I sat there, the anger began to solidify, hardening into something darker, something colder. I knew one thing with certainty. Daniels hadn't broken me yet. He might have taken everything else, but he hadn't taken my will to fight, my determination to see. In the hollow silence of that cell, something within me shifted. The anger that had once flared so wildly was no longer chaotic but cold, steady, like the calm before a storm. Daniels had stolen nearly everything, my marriage, my peace, my reputation. But there was one thing he couldn't touch, my resolve. I realized that I couldn't crumble now. I had to endure, to see this through, no matter how much he tried to drag me down. After what felt like an eternity in that bleak, confining space, my case finally came to court. Daniels must have thought he'd buried me beneath a mountain of accusations, lies expertly disguised as truth. He'd called on his influence, his power, to paint me as the villain, a man driven by resentment, desperate to smear him with baseless accusations. But he had underestimated one thing. I had truth on my side, and it was only a matter of time before it saw the light. When I stood before the judge, I felt every gaze in that courtroom trained on me, each one a silent judgment, a spectator eager to see whether I'd crumble beneath the weight of Daniel's story. But I held my ground, unwavering, each word a deliberate step in dismantling his facade. Piece by piece, I laid out the facts. I exposed the details I'd uncovered, the secrets he'd tried to bury under layers of intimidation and wealth. The audience in the courtroom listened, their faces changing as they realized there was something sinister beneath Daniel's polished exterior. Witness after witness came forward, each one adding to the growing pile of evidence. Former employees spoke of unethical practices, of his manipulation, of his tendency to bulldoze anyone who crossed him. And then there were the threats, messages Daniels hadn't managed to erase, digital fingerprints that spoke volumes. They showed the judge, the jury, and the world that this wasn't the work of an unstable employee trying to destroy a powerful man. It was the story of a powerful man who thought he was untouchable, who thought he could buy or silence anyone who got in his way. Daniel's lawyers fought hard, spinning tales of my supposed instability, of a man scorned by his wife's betrayal, a narrative he thought would deflect the focus back to me. But his arguments crumbled under the scrutiny of facts. Witnesses recounted stories of fear, of Daniel's threats, of the schemes he'd kept hidden just beneath the surface. The pattern was unmistakable. This was a man who used people, who discarded them without a second thought, who thought he was untouchable. The trial dragged on, Every hour a grueling battle, but I felt a new kind of strength with each passing day. For the first time in months, I saw a path forward, a light breaking through the darkness that had surrounded me. I watched as Daniel's mask cracked, his composure faltering as more and more of his truth came to light. The man who had once held all the power was now trapped in the spotlight, his lies exposed for all to see. When the verdict finally came, it was like a release, a weight lifting from my chest. Daniels was found guilty, not only for his threats against me, but for the years of unethical practices he'd hidden so carefully. He was sentenced to prison, stripped of his power, his empire dismantled brick by brick. It wasn't just a victory, it was justice, a reckoning he'd never expected. In the days that followed, I found myself standing in the ruins of what had once been my life. My marriage, my career, my home, all of it was gone, torn apart by the man who thought he could control me. But for the first time, I felt free. I was no longer haunted by the betrayal, by the bitterness, by the ghost of the life I'd lost. Instead, I stood on the threshold of something new, a blank slate that stretched out before me, waiting to be filled with something real. I sold the house, got rid of the reminders of that past life, the memories that had once felt so impossible to escape. I moved to a new city, a place where I could start fresh, where I wasn't bound by the shadows of what had happened. The scars of that betrayal still lingered, a reminder of the price I'd paid, but they were fading, growing fainter with each day, each new beginning. In time, I found peace, not in forgetting, but in accepting that what had happened didn't define me. I was stronger now, tempered by fire, my resolve forged in the crucible of pain and loss. And as I walked forward into my new life, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone hold that kind of power over me again.